All right, hello everyone, and welcome to University 300. At this point, you've probably already watched the introduction video. If you haven't, please go do that so you get a chance to meet your two instructors, obviously one of which is me, and learn a little bit more of the course. But if you have watched the video, you'll know that my name is Carol Fisher. I use she, her pronouns, and I will be one of your instructors for this course again. So, welcome to week one. Before we move forward, just a few small disclaimers. I live in a one-bedroom apartment near downtown Portland with my dog and my partner, so you will probably hear some ambient noise. You'll definitely hear my dog at some point. You'll probably hear my partner. I also have a cuckoo clock that goes off every 30 minutes, so if you hear like a weird bird noise, that's what it is. And I have two monitors, so if you see me like look away from the camera, it's because I'm looking at the slides on my other monitors. Okay, now with the disclaimers out of the way, let's roll. So this slide is just talking about what we're going to cover this week. We'll be exploring the question of what research is. We'll cover the Burkean parlor, the idea of the scholarly conversation. We'll try to answer what is research, as well as explore secondary research, science and scientific information, humanities and information in the humanities, social sciences and the information in the social sciences, as well as interdisciplinary research and the research process. And then finally, we'll go over the homework for this week. So before we dive into the notion of the scholarly conversation, I want to read you this rather long metaphor, which is often used to describe the never-ending conversation regarding research. So Kenneth Burke writes, "Imagine that you enter a parlor. You come late. When you arrive, others have long preceded you, and they are engaged in a heated discussion. A discussion too heated for them to pause and tell you exactly what it is about. In fact, the discussion had already begun long before any of them got there, so no one who is present is qualified to retrace for you all the steps that had gone before. You listen for a while until you decide that you have caught the tenor of the argument. Then you put in your oar. Someone answers, you answer him, another comes to your defense, another aligns himself against you to either the embarrassment or gratification of your opponent, depending upon the quality of your ally's assistance. However, the discussion is interminable. The hour grows late, you must depart, and you do depart with the discussion still vigorously in process." So, despite sounding a bit pretentious, this metaphor does a relatively good job at illustrating what the idea of a scholarly conversation is. It's essentially an exceedingly long conversation, but instead of talking back and forth at a party, you respond in the conversation via research articles and book chapters. The scholarly conversation is one that has been occurring for centuries. So, you may be wondering, where do we enter the conversation if this is one that's been going on for centuries? So in our case, the literature search or perhaps a research paper is your opportunity to listen to the experts or scholars, what the experts or scholars are saying about your topic. You can listen to the conversation, put in your metaphysical oar, so to speak, and exit the conversation all during the process of writing one paper. And yes, even your research papers for classes are considered contributions to the scholarly conversation, and that's really important to remember. So this is kind of a continuation of the last slide. Before we fully enter the scholarly conversation, we need to learn a little bit more about our topic. So learning the basics of a topic or idea is often referred to as background research. During this background research, we start to begin listening to the conversation from the experts, beginning our entrance into the scholarly conversation. Part of research involves generating a good research question, which we'll go over later in the semester. But in order to dive into the scholarly conversation, we need to devise a good research question that asks relevant questions. Only after the development of a research question can we enter into the conversation and give our well-informed opinion, which is this little bit of the slide. At this point, you may be wondering, what is research? Research is a process that creates new knowledge, and there are two different types of research. The first is primary research, and the second is secondary research. Primary research is where new data is created. The easiest example of this would be if we wanted to know how many geese migrate over the state of Washington. We'd have to devise a system to count all of the geese, and then we will have created new data. Secondary research is a summary synthesis or interpretation that is created from existing data. If I'm embarking on secondary research, I might ask the same question about the geese, but use previous research reports as my data. Both secondary and primary research are important and both create new knowledge. Secondary research creates new knowledge because it requires new thinking, and both are valuable and respected in academia. So what about secondary research for college courses? So, as you've probably already experienced, most research done by undergraduate students is secondary research, which is the kind of research that we will primarily focus on during this class. However, that doesn't mean that you will never have the opportunity to participate in primary research on campus. Faculty around campus are always conducting research, and there are usually ample opportunities for undergraduate students to participate, and depending on the discipline, a lot of faculty members have their own labs. And like I mentioned earlier, even when you're engaging in secondary research, you're still creating new knowledge through original thought on what you have read. So you are all going to be participating and have already participated in the scholarly conversation. So during this class, we will learn how to find information, efficiently search for information, learn how to evaluate information, and how to ethically use information. So how does research differ between the disciplines? Each academic discipline is unique in its primary research methods and in how those methods are communicated to other scholars in the discipline. There are 3 primary disciplines that we will talk about in this class, the first of which is the sciences, which are also known as the natural sciences, the physical sciences, or the hard sciences, but they're all just kind of that general science. And then we have the humanities and the social sciences. As researchers, it's important that we know what kind of information to expect in a specific discipline and where to look for that information. There's a lot of nuances to each discipline, but by the end of this course, you should feel comfortable navigating research throughout these 3 primary disciplines. So starting off talking about the disciplines, we're going to start off with science. So researchers in science-based disciplines attempt to explain the natural world by applying the scientific method. Science disciplines are fields like biology, chemistry, physics, zoology, astronomy, geology, computer science, medicine, and math. Scientific research applies a scientific theory to a research question. Scientific research is usually empirical, descriptive, experimental, and often includes data from a laboratory or experiment. Talking is taxing sometimes. So, moving on to scientific information. Scientific research is often shared when scientists participate in joint projects. They often collaborate with several different institutions, and research findings are often shared at conferences. Researchers also shared and discussed via email, field reports, select websites, and professional organizations. So, how do folks outside of science disciplines find this research? Generally, new results of scientific research are published in peer-reviewed journals and then are disseminated through news articles, blogs, magazines, and eventually published in books. Journal articles, also known as peer-reviewed journals, are usually considered the most direct and complete source of information. So, currency of information or relevancy of information in the sciences is vital, and therefore information must be current in the sciences. And then when it comes to funding, research in the sciences is often the most well-funded and well-respected of the 3 primary disciplines. So, the second discipline we have is humanities. Research in the humanities often explores meanings, artifacts, and legacies of human culture. Humanity disciplines are fields like philosophy, cultural studies, literature, art, dance, architecture, music, theater, film, and religious studies. And depending on who you ask, history can often be considered a humanities. Knowledge in the humanities is considered to be cumulative. Researchers identify a question to be explored or answered, and the research in humanities often involves analyzing, evaluating, critiquing, and interpreting historical records and artifacts. So when it comes to information in the humanities, research is often shared through books, articles, and at conferences and through presentations and other events. Diaries, letters of work, or works of art, literature, or other artifacts may be used as primary data sources. Just like scientific information, we can also find research from the humanities in journal articles and books. When it comes to currency is not always as important in the humanities since the best primary and secondary sources can often remain relevant for many centuries, although interpretations may change and do change. Generally speaking, disciplines in the humanities are not as well funded as those in the sciences and social sciences. And then our third discipline is social sciences. So researchers in the social sciences study the structure and function of society. Social science disciplines are fields like anthropology, psychology, sociology, economics, political science, government, human resources, linguistics, social work, communication, education, and sometimes history. Methods of research vary, but research in the social sciences is usually planned and systemic. Social science research often involves quantitative or qualitative methods, ethnography, case studies, interviews, statistics, field notes, surveys, and literature reviews. So just like information in the sciences and humanities, researchers in the social sciences often share information through books, articles, and at conferences and through presentations. We can also find research from the social sciences in journal articles and books. So currency/relevancy is still important in the social sciences, although sources usually remain relevant longer than with the sciences. Disciplines in the social sciences are traditionally not as well funded as the sciences, but may be better funded than disciplines in the humanities. So while the three disciplinary categories are dominant, they're not the only way to divide up knowledge. Keep in mind that the definition and values of academic disciplines change over time, and there are many newer academic disciplines that cross boundaries between these three areas. Many research questions will require you to search for information from more than one discipline, and that's okay. It's important to remember that these disciplines are not all-encompassing, but instead can provide useful categories for searching through information. The real world is much more nuanced and complicated, and changes faster than the categories we can use to label it. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the research process. So library and information science, also known as LIS, is one of the social sciences. Hey, that's me, part of the social sciences. And research in the LIS field is primarily interested in the process of creating, organizing, storing, and seeking and accessing information. Carol Colthall, not Cthulhu like the monster, is a librarian who has done extensive research on the information search process, or ISP, and she was one of the first scholars to write about the emotional or affective aspects of the information search, which leads us to our homework for this week. So there's about 3 parts for the homework, none of which should take you too terribly long. First, you're going to read an article from Carol Colthall, and it's going to be about the information search process. It'll be linked on the Canvas page for this week. But after you read through her article, which is the densest piece of information we'll ask you to work through this semester, you'll have to respond to some reflection questions on your personal research journal discussion board on Canvas. And then after that, please introduce yourself on our introductions discussion board, because it's a good way to kind of get to know your classmates, get to know us a little bit better. But that is all we have for this week. So please let Nicholas or I know if you have any questions or you need any clarifications. If you need some help navigating Canvas, I know it's kind of a new thing here, just let us know. But other than that, I hope you have a great week, and I'll see you next week. Bye!